I started out, even as a very young child, being very interested in what we call the appearance reality distinction. So I was struck by the fact that science was telling us that the appearances were very misleading as to what the natural world was like, that it was really composed of very small things that had lots and lots of space between them and had properties that were very unlike what we were seeing in the ordinary world of what did Austin call them, middle-sized specimens of dry goods, um, and and that. So I thought what I'd really like to do is find out what the world is really like. And very naturally at the time, I thought, well, that requires study of very basic physics. And when I started to study very fundamental physical theory, quantum mechanics, general relativity, and so on, very quickly discovered that the physicists were not at all interested in the question, what did this show us about the nature of the world underlying the appearances? That they didn't want to stop and talk about the problems in interpreting quantum mechanics or interpreting general relativity. They were very good at the formalism. They wanted to impart the formalism, to use it in various kinds of application, but were very impatient with philosophical questions about what this showed about the nature of the world. And they recommended that I go and talk to the philosophers about these things. And so I quickly discovered that the question whether physics tells you how things really are is a philosophical question about physics that the philosophers are very interested in, but that the physicists are not. So when I first went to graduate school, I went to graduate school in a history and philosophy of science program with the intention on working on the foundations of physics. But then the other aspect of the answer is that virtually every interesting philosophical question and concept is linked to virtually every other one. And so to really make progress with questions in the foundations of physics required looking more broadly. So for instance, in my case, the trajectory went something like this. Interested in the philosophy of physics led to more general interest in issues in the philosophy of science. Philosophy of science involves talking about the reference of theoretical terms, so you get interested in the theory of reference. The theory of reference is bound up with the theory of meaning, so you get interested in the theory of meaning. Then somebody comes along and tells you that meaning is importantly bound up with the notion of rule following. And so, one thing leads to another. And before I knew it, I was writing a dissertation on Wittgenstein and Kripke rule following, having been very naturally led there by my interest in the philosophy of physics. But that's an example of the way in which these issues are so interwoven with one another that to do well with any one of them requires you to know a great deal about all of these adjacent areas. Some of the adjacency becoming more and more stretched. So that was the explanation in my case for how I ended up writing about rule following. But of course, that process continues. So rule following involves issues about normativity. It involves issues about dispositions. And so you then get interested in metaethics, because that's where they study normativity. And one thing leads to another. At the end of the day, I ended up being interested in just about everything because they're all connected.
Well, you have an interest in everything, and hopefully we'll get to some of those things. But first, I'm going to jump on one of the earlier things you said, which was your interest in the nature of the world underlying appearances, and this in connection with the foundations of physics. And from speaking with your colleague Tim Maudlin or David Albert at Columbia, I'm always struck by how much more interested physicists are in questions like the mass of an electron or a neutrino or something like that, rather than whether or not the many worlds theory of quantum mechanics is correct, which to me has much more drastic implications for our worldview. And it is such a strange sociological phenomenon that these questions in the foundations have been relegated to philosophy departments rather than physics departments. So I'm glad, for instance, that Tim has the John Bell Institute, where hopefully more of these questions will be more concertedly answered or investigated.
I think it's a wonderful thing that, he has tried to make these questions about what physics tells us about the nature of the world central and important, and is training a generation of people to investigate them. I mean, they are, they're very difficult because they require you to be expert at so many different things. Expert in the physics, of course, but then in these very complicated philosophical notions about ontology and determinacy and truth and objectivity and so forth. And so, it's understandable why the physicists, in their desire to apply the theory, are impatient with these fundamental philosophical questions. But it would be a tremendous loss for the intellectual world if no one was capable of pursuing these questions and of making progress with them.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm with you. It kind of makes me sad to see or hear the physicists poo-poo the philosophers working in the foundation. So, Stephen Hawking. I just spoke a couple of days ago with Sean Carroll and Slavoj Žižek on quantum mechanics, and I think it was Žižek maybe who brought it up, or maybe I read this elsewhere, but Stephen Hawking, for instance, said philosophy is dead. And it's...
and even Steven Weinberg, who kind of in his later years got more interested in the philosophical issues, he still was very contemptuous of the work that he had seen. Partly what's going on here is not unrelated to something that I know you wanted to ask me about in connection with the Sokal hoax. And that is that there are, in the academic culture as we have it, there are lots of disciplines that in somehow or other engage in what looks like philosophical work. And, some of it is better than others. But to the physicists who can't make these subtle distinctions between the people who know what they're talking about and the people who don't know what they're talking about, they end up having this very negative impression of the thing that's called philosophy of science. My favorite example of this is the case of the French sociologist / philosopher of science Bruno Latour. And Bruno Latour wrote a very famous paper, a paper that is, very highly regarded in certain circles, though not by me and not by philosophers generally, called Ramses II, Could He Have Died of Tuberculosis? And this was written in response to French archaeologists who had concluded from studying the mummy of Ramses II that he had probably died of tuberculosis. And in this paper, Latour says that he could not possibly have died of tuberculosis because the bacillus that's responsible for tuberculosis wasn't discovered until 1892 in Berlin. So how could he have died of this bacillus in ancient Egypt? And so this is an example of a kind of constructivist view of the nature of reality that is popular in certain circles and leads to saying some pretty absurd things. These are the results of confusions that can be diagnosed and pulled apart. But now, and this very man, Bruno Latour, I don't mean to besmirch him, he did very valuable work, as it were, in the kind of field work in the sociology of science, observing scientists at work in the lab and so on. But he was proposed for a chair at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton by the Social Science School. And this was the first time, I believe, that the scientists there vetoed a selection made by their colleagues in the School of Social Science, because they just couldn't believe what they were seeing about some of these claims. So what happens is that if a physicist who doesn't have a lot of time to have a very fine-grained view of what counts as philosophy out there, hears that this person is of such prominence that they're being proposed for a lifetime chair at the Institute for Advanced Study, and they can't really make sense of some of the claims for which this person is most famous, then we all get tarred by the same brush, so to speak. And I think that's part of what's responsible for the scientists having a very dim view of what philosophy of science is about.